you've made me sound very interesting. I really appreciate that. This is my discussion. You've given the title already, but that's in the middle is my little frog playing Frogger, because I'm a visual artist as well as a game designer and consultant and a academic who is currently independent, but hoping to be less so in the near future. But more news on that as we go. So today I really want to talk about a game called The Missing, which is this game. I'm looking to the right because that's where my second screen is, and that's where the presentation is for me. It was released in 2018 by White Owls Inc., which is the studio that is run by Hidetaka Suehiro, or Swery, as he likes to be known online. So I'll continue to talk about him like that. This game is really, really unique. It has a particularly unique approach to the subject matter, which is not what it originally seems to be when you start the game. In fact, I'm going to give a bit of a content advisory about this. It is about a trans person's experience, and some of it involves stress and self-harm connotation. So if you would like to consider being part of this conversation, please do. If not, I understand entirely, but I just want to let you know. But as I said, the initial outset of the game actually doesn't state that up front. It is actually presented with the understanding of the audience itself. It uses the conceptions, the assumptions, the received wisdom of the audience and players to make a misdirection or a fake. And I'll go through that and why it's particularly interesting and what it leads me to. So I think The Missing is an LGBTQ narrative and mechanical misdirect to create another LGBTQ game experience. This is a image from the opening. The opening scene guides the player to believe that there is a specific focus of the game. There are two women here. JJ is the playable character, and Emily, an NPC. They enter a boat and travel to a mysterious island. They're seen camping here, sitting by a fire and giggling and apparently flirting. Romantic music plays. They talk about being together forever and how they are romantic, and they inch closer together. They rest their heads on each other. They hold hands. They appear to be very near to a kiss as the image fades to black. On the black screen, we hear Emily's warped voice call out to JJ, who now becomes playable. Your character wakes up alone by the bench they've been sitting on, and the scene fades in. The achievement that then pops up immediately and distractedly on the left-hand side says, "Where's Emily?" Now, this depends on the system that you're using, but even on the Nintendo Switch, which doesn't actually have achievements, this will pop. And that is interesting for a very specific reason. Your character then calls out to Emily and goes in search. Seemingly, this is the goal of your game. Well, the player guides JJ through a series of seemingly random locations and even seemingly random characters. This is a doctor with a moose head, because of course it is. And prior to that, there was a flying whale, which is excellent. And also, surprisingly, not as random as you think it will be. I will go into that later. In contrast to the apparent random imagery, which Swery is very well known for, there are very recognizable puzzle platforming mechanics, some of which I'm going to go through right now. There are very culturally recognizable gameplay elements and narrative elements, and they direct the player to assume that the game is focused on the search for Emily, who is apparently JJ's romantic partner, but that they are not out about this to their wider social environment. The opening scene, as I just said, all of the elements of it, the cutscene, the interaction, dialogue, music, gameplay, and even the pop of that achievement, all seem to reference a lesbian relationship without directly mentioning it. This is a common media trope using metaphor and implication to describe something that is not actually presented. If you want to look at some early research on that, Vito Russo's book, The Celluloid Closet, goes into this, and it's akin to modern, and I don't like the word, but I'm going to use it for shorthand, queer baiting in games, and this is discussed by the likes of Jessica Catherine Needham in 2018. Very useful. Emily travels, always just out of reach, from left to right, pursued by an antagonistic monster. Now, this may sound very familiar to anyone who's ever played Mario, because every time you nearly catch up, she's just out of sight and gone. She is literally the princess in another castle trope. There is a dedicated holler button. The X button you can press will shout out Emily's name, much like the meme generating mechanic of Heavy Rain. Press X to Jason. It's very similar. phone messages pop up on your cellular phone that appear at set points to allude to a secret that these two are hiding from their school friends and from JJ's family. This includes the ones that you receive as a natural part of the game, but there are also the optional collectibles, which seem completely random, but of course are not random at all, and they're part of the same set narrative. There's a horror monster antagonist that is seemingly unstoppable and chases the protagonist at set times through set piece gameplay. If you want to think of an equivalency here, Resident Evil series would definitely be very similar. These are all recognizable horror puzzle platform genre elements. In fact, they're recognizable indie horror puzzle platform genres. And that is very much done on purpose in order to make the deception. Okay. There is one exception, though. There is a very specific mechanic, and very spectacular one, a mechanic that involves JJ being mutilated in any number of ways, using the effects of this in order to navigate the puzzles in her environment. There are several distinct ways, stages, and effects of this mutilation mechanic. In an excellent blog post by Nadia M., this person talks about how the design of this particular game allows the player to experience the subject almost viscerally. She suggests that the gameplay element in which the player can only progress by controlling the titular character here to brutalize herself acts as a metaphor for certain socio-culturally constructed trans experiences of self-loathing and perseverance. The blog post put into words some of my own. I promise that wasn't me and it wasn't the game. I don't know who's not been muted, but someone's very loud. Okay. All right. Okay. Well, I will move on for now to this lovely slide, because the best thing about Swery is that Swery will tell you exactly what they were doing at the time. Oh my goodness, I think it's the previous speaker. It's not me, I promise.
I'm sorry. Okay, just give me a second.
I think it's.
I muted. I pressed mute and I pressed the wrong mute. I'm sorry.
Okay, you didn't hear me for that last bit, did you? Okay, I'll try again. Michelle, in the chat is someone I know. She suggested I was turning into a robot, and she may be right. Anyway, I will return to the subject at hand. The best thing about Swery is that Swery tells you exactly what he's doing after he's done it. And this is from a GDC panel in 2019 in which he discusses his process. He outlines the specific goals that he had to create a sense of empathy in the player through the initial misdirect, which he addresses directly, amusingly enough, and the subsequent game design choices. He uses a version of the mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics model to analyze his own game. He presents an attempt to engender empathy from the character by the player, using the horror elements, a sense of disempowerment, and even frustration in the first half of the game. Especially, the player is made to feel isolated and even fearful. Upon the reveal of the character's true experience, which happens towards the end of the game, that she is trans, and that this is the secret that's always being hidden, he hopes the player will be sympathetic and empathetic, quote, whether or not they were in a similar situation to the main character, unquote, and would as such, and this is Swery, quote, acquire diversified knowledge, end quote. So Swery hopes that the game will provide an opportunity that will educate and or provide a moment of recognition for the player, especially on a trans person's possible experience. And this is told to you right up front in the statement that is played right before you start the game, which is this. This is his mission statement. So did it work? Well, this is something I can go into further in my subsequent writing because it's way too long to go into here and it's also very complicated. But I am happy to offer a summary of my initial thoughts because it does lead to a more broad point that I'm trying to make. So like I say, the simple and complicated answer is yes and no, it didn't work. And yes, it did work. But what I want to reflect on is the attempt itself. It's not unproblematic. There are uses of certain tropes, for example, that can be seen as quite reductive here. For example, by using certain gameplay mechanics and narrative tropes, Swery might be argued to reinscribe them. We already mentioned the queer baiting of the opening scene, the misdirect itself. But the experience of JJ most certainly falls also into the trans reveal and the tragic queer narrative. And if you want to look at those, again, Russo's book in 1987 discusses it well as several recent examples. But just to sort of give a summary, you can look at the films like The Crying Game from 1992, which is the classic surprise, there's a trans person in your story, to tragic stories of all kinds, which I don't really want to go into here. But yes, there is a difference though. The ending, you're going to be okay. The narrative doesn't actually follow the usual queer tragic narrative that Russo discusses in his book. The trans person does not die at the end. So sorry, ruined the game for you. So it's not a simple critique of the inclusion of this trope, because like yesterday, the Transgender Day of Remembrance, if you were aware of that, as an event that marks the violence that we as a community still suffer and is a part of our experience, sadly. So in this case, you could say that this is a representative story, but at least with a happy ending. She wakes up to realize that the apparently abstract figures that she's been seeing, the settings were in her mind, that she was experiencing her own near death, and she was being saved by medical professionals. And Emily had been calling out to her as she lay dying there from self-inflicted wounds. When she awakes, JJ appears as she does in her real world, with a body that may have been assigned male at birth, but she's never mispronounced. Rather, she's welcomed by Emily and still referred to by her gender. This runs counter to the trope that I mentioned before and presents a moment of some dissonance and discord. So this leads me to my project, what I'm actually going to try and do with all this and what I'm going to be doing forward. From the advice and the help of others who I'm going to mention right at the end, I was led to a close reading or autoethnographic approach to game design. I ground my work very much in what Rose Klein calls the queer pedagogy in games having a distinct overlap as they provide an opportunity to teach the critique and questioning specifically of normative structures. Z argues really convincingly, quote, queer play can be used to augment and support queer pedagogy, and conversely, queer pedagogy can inform new ways of building opportunities for queer play. Games function as systems and encourage a player to interact with, learn from, and perhaps even subvert those systems. And that's been mentioned several times today already. And thus, they provide a unique vantage point to explore these things. Theorists like Samantha Allen argue that video games provide a unique opportunity for feminist pedagogy and game-based learning. She describes how she's used a number of games to talk about trans experience, to introduce her students to notions of intersectional oppression. She suggests that through the play experience, empathy is elicited from the player through which they can learn to become more aware of their social context and experience of others. I'll draw on game-based learning approach, as Alan suggests here, an approach that I find particularly useful to explore the potential of video games to provide opportunities to teach on trans experience. I wish to avoid, however, and this is an important point, an oversimplification of the ways in which affect may be generated through gameplay. I'm very well aware that these are complicated systems. What influence it may have on whom at what time. Swery was very much looking about translating a trans experience for a non-trans audience. And the curiosity is, well, what does the missing say to a trans audience? To me, it was cultural experiences like this and the knowledge they create or elicit in this way. We can examine how experience may be communicated and provide opportunities to express and explore trans subjectivities in a potentially safer and pedagogical context. As I've noted here, I'll look at the opportunities that video games might provide for cis people to learn about trans experience, but I also want to look at how trans people will experience that. I'll be looking at lots of different games. I'll be looking at the ways in which those games can be modified. I'm going to look at the ways in which players use those games to tell their own stories. We've had some wonderful examples here recently. People will reference Pony Island, they'll reference the Stanley Parable as some of them, but I also want to look at games that are modified by trans people. I mean, Skyrim is still getting modified, and I'm still talking to my friend Dr. J about how Skyrim can be modified to be more gender, give her more to give them more gender options to be non-binary in that space. I'm really interested in all these aspects, and that's what I'm hoping will be the basis of my PhD going forward. And I'm certainly going to be writing on it no matter what anybody says. So yeah, I think that's where we're at. Sorry, I had to rush through. I was a little discombobulated by the robot moment. I just wanted to say thank you for listening. Here's a series of names that have supported me through this and have led me to these ideas. And I really want to mention them: Sabina Hara, Doris Rush, Kata Spiel, Forrest Kayele, Emily wrote down Yori, who was here earlier, and Michelle Belch, who's in the audience right now, and Maura Bettoni and Corinne Baird, because we don't often talk about these things when we're talking about our ideas, and I really wanted to mention them. There's my contact details